Climate change remains high on the agenda on both sides of the Atlantic. The United States has passed a ruling that greenhouse gas emissions constitute a health hazard, delivering the conference in Copenhagen a welcome victory in its negotiations to combat global warming. The Environmental Protection Agency will have the authority to regulate emissions, whilst a key piece of legislation to curb gases by 2020 is stuck in the Senate.
Today, I'm proud to announce that EPA has finalized its endangerment finding on greenhouse gas pollution and is now authorized and obligated to make reasonable efforts to reduce greenhouse pollutants under the Clean Air Act.
The agency's ruling was welcomed by representatives in Copenhagen who said it would boost US President Obama's credibility.
It also means that we arrive at the climate talks in Copenhagen with a clear demonstration of our commitment to facing this global challenge. We hope that today's announcement serves as another incentive for far-reaching accords in our meetings this week.
Right. Meanwhile, the gathering in Copenhagen got off to an upbeat start, with Denmark's Prime Minister saying that a deal to combat climate change is now within our reach. However, some of the opening speakers, including Ivo de Boer, the head of the UN Climate Change Secretariat, acknowledged that key issues remain to be solved.
Well, there are many countries, including the G8 plus 5, the European Union, that have committed to a maximum 2-degree temperature increase. But what the small island nations are telling us here is that for anything above a 1.5% increase would be a suicide pact for them, because it would result in their nations disappearing. And part of the purpose of the negotiations over the next 2 weeks is going to be to see how countries can reach common ground on that very difficult issue.
Our colleagues also spoke to Connie Hedegaard, who is the conference president and Denmark's former climate change minister, and asked her if she felt the political will was strong enough for leaders to find a common ground.
110 leaders, heads of state and government, will be arriving in Copenhagen next week as a sign that, yes, the political will is big and it has never been bigger.
OK, let's move on and talk about some more kind of aspects of the climate change debate. We're joined by Bruce Duguid, Head of Investor Engagement at the Carbon Trust. I know you've come out with this report, which I believe is published today, in fact. Now, we know that civil aviation is a relatively small industry if you look at the figures for the industry, but if you look at the figures for the impacts on the climate, rather larger than you might expect, coming for a certain amount of flack, I suppose, from members of the public. When airlines join an emissions trading scheme, according to your findings, what will the impact be?
Well, today we're launching a report on the financial impact of airlines joining cap and trade schemes. For example, the airlines in Europe join the European Union emissions trading system on the 1st of January 2012, so about 2 years' time. And they will be net buyers of allowances in the scheme. They will need to buy between 23 and 35 billion euros worth of allowances. And that will then reward the most efficient players in the system. So we see the most efficient players being able to gain a 20 to 40% profit advantage over the average in the market, and perhaps 40 to 80% over the least performing players. There is a question of what the overall impact of the scheme will be for the industry. And what we believe in the report is that the short-haul leisure market will be the most exposed in terms of price competition, with perhaps the most efficient players just passing through the cost of the scheme, but other players losing. Whereas in the long-haul and business sectors, which are less price sensitive, you may see some airlines passing across more of the cost of the carbon than they actually bear in the scheme, and therefore making some money. OK,
let's take a close look at what this means for some of the individual companies. Should we expect then that the low-cost short-haul carriers, the likes of, in Europe at least, Ryanair, EasyJet, Air Berlin, etc., will be more affected just as a whole because of the nature of their business model, and that the full-service carriers, the Air France KLMs, British Airways, etc., will be less affected? Is it that clear-cut?
I think that's the way it will work in terms of the business sectors. Now, what you may find is that some of those short-haul carriers are very efficient, and they may be able to gain a price advantage against their competitors. And so you may see that some of them actually do quite well out of this scheme in terms of their market share, even if they don't actually seek to make money in the short term.
Some of the assumptions about the price sensitivity or lack thereof in the business class and first class sector would seem to be a bit out of date now. We've certainly seen a big change in the structure of the airline industry in the past year or two. Do you think maybe those long-haul carriers won't be quite as protected as they were 18 months ago? I mean, should they expect to come under increasing pressure from this scheme as buying trends change?
Well, it may be the difference between the short term and the long term, but the impact of having this carbon price on a ticket price for a business class seat might be less than 1%, but on a short haul seat could be in the region of 7 to 8%. So you'll see that much more sensitivity on the short haul flights. There is another point as well. We don't believe in this report that the cap and trade scheme will be the regulatory endgame for the industry, that there will actually need to be other measures to curb the growth of the industry and to encourage research and development to take place. And unless breakthroughs can be achieved, actually the industry will have limits to its growth, and so will not be able to grow at the rates it has historically in order to meet climate change targets. And that's because the airline industry is one of the fastest growing sources of emissions, and that can't last forever.
Bruce, if I could ask you, I mean, the general lines look fantastic once exactly the plane gathers momentum. But I mean, we have to understand that this is a process that will go through a transition phase until all the airlines are basically playing by the rules and basically trying to achieve more and more efficiency in the cost structure. In this transition period, isn't that going to create more volatility actually on the cost base structure of some of the minor league airlines?
I think you're absolutely right that for managers of airline businesses, they're going to need to manage not only the jet fuel price volatility, but also the volatility in the carbon markets. And so they'll need to be active now in terms of managing their strategy to buy those vital carbon permits.
I want to revisit one point you made, and this was the optimistic assumptions for airline industry growth historically compared to the forward-looking, because we often hear political debates in the United Kingdom and elsewhere about the impending doom for the City of London if we don't have Terminal 6, for instance, if we don't have a third runway at Heathrow, if we don't have expansion of Stansted, of Gatwick, of Cliff in Kent, or you name it. But the fact remains that they can't cope with the aviation space over the United Kingdom as it is at the moment, let alone expansion. Don't we just have to admit that we can't grow this industry because there isn't enough space in the skies now on some of the key hubs such as London, Heathrow and elsewhere to grow at the kind of levels they want to? And that's potentially the biggest break on the increase in carbon in the industry rather than any legislation.
Well, that may be the case in terms of there are natural limits ultimately to the growth. You can't have millions of planes in the sky, but the industry was projected to grow at about 2.5% through to 2030. And what may happen is that their growth is limited to more like 1% per annum to 2030. So that is much slower growth than even the modest rates that they were expecting.
There are other industries in the transport arena which actually need to bear larger brunt. I mean, I hear a lot about marine emissions as well, and that they rival, if not are greater than the airline industry as well. I mean, the airline industry will turn around and say, well, what about emissions here, what about emissions there?
Well, that's absolutely right. You were talking about Copenhagen earlier, and the two industries that have so far not been regulated or included in any international treaty on emissions are international airlines and international shipping. There's no tax on airline fuel, on kerosene, and similarly for shipping. And so both of those industries are looking like potential targets to be brought into a regime and to be sources potentially of financing as part of a global deal on climate change.
All right, Bruce, thank you very much indeed for giving us the very interesting findings of your report. Bruce Duguid updating us on the Carbon Trust's latest key findings.